An old man walks into a luxury bank and quietly says, "This place belongs to me." Everyone laughs until he pulls out the forgotten founding documents. What follows? A scandal buried for decades, a truth denied by power, and a reckoning no one saw coming. This isn't fiction. It's justice resurfaced. On an October afternoon in Halcyon Ridge, the golden light of days streamed to the tall glass windows of the Sterling Trust Bank branch, casting shimmering bands across the ivory marble floor. The interior of the bank exuded an air of refined elegance. Every potted plant, every stretch of carpeting, even the rhythmic clacking of keyboards on the teller counter seemed orchestrated, like a wordless symphony of power and order. And then the glass doors opened. An elderly man stepped inside, his frame hunched as if the weight of an entire life bore down on his thin shoulders. He wore a dark brown wool coat, so wore it was difficult to tell where the fabric ended and the road thus began. His gray hair was unkempt, his shoes scuffed nearly to the point of falling apart at the soles. Slung over one shoulder was a faded canvas bag, rough and time-worn, like the wrinkled skin of the man who carried it. His name was Solomon Everett Cross, 85 years old, unknown, and today he had returned to reclaim his name. A blonde woman in an expensive trench coat near the door silently pulled her purse closer to her chest, unable to hide the flicker of unease in her eyes. Deeper inside, two tellers, Ethan Moore and Tyler Chin, paused their typing, leaning toward each other to whisper. "Probably another homeless guy who got lost," Ethan scoffed. Tyler shrugged with a smirk. "Maybe he thinks this is a food bank." Solomon didn't respond. He continued walking slowly, his deep black eyes unwavering, as if they could see right through every doubtful, dismissive gaze aimed at him. Security took notice immediately. Kyle Brenner, the branch's head of security, tall, brawny, somewhere in his mid-30s, frowned. With a stiff posture and a permanent scowl, he took a step forward, one hand resting lightly on his holstered weapon. The entire bank seemed to hold its breath. Solomon came to a halt in the center of the lobby. All eyes were on him. He lifted his head, the golden light catching the lines etched deep into his face, and spoke, his voice gravelly slow, but unmistakably clear. "This bank belongs to me." The once quiet room erupted with laughter. A wave of derision swept through the lobby. Someone chuckled so hard they choked. One employee even mockingly clapped. To them, the old man's declaration was nothing more than a circus act, absurd and harmless. But Solomon didn't move, not an inch. His eyes quietly scanned the room, as if committing every face to memory. He didn't argue. He didn't retreat. He simply stood, unyielding, like a stone statue in a gold-plated cathedral, in a place where every tile beneath his feet once bore his sweat and toil, yet no one remembered his name. "This bank belongs to me." That statement, spoken softly into the hushed room, struck like a cold slap across the invisible order of Sterling Trust Bank. But in just a moment, laughter erupted, first quietly, then swelling into a wave of open mockery. "What did he just say?" A young woman near the service counter burst out laughing, clutching her chest as if struggling to breathe from the absurdity. "Does he think he's in some kind of soap opera?" Ethan Moore muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear, not even bothering to hide it. "Told you, these homeless black guys are always dreaming big." Tyler Chin snickered. "Yeah, probably thinks he's playing Monopoly." Still, Solomon stood unmoved. His eyes swept over each face, shaking heads, smirking mouths, hands half covering chuckles. It was a silence forged in steel, the silence of a man who had endured these looks for 87 years in a world that never really welcomed him. Kyle Brenner strode forward, his polished black shoes tapping sharply across the marble floor. Cutting through the laughter, he stood nearly 6 feet tall, built like a linebacker. The gleam of a security badge caught the light on his navy shirt, and his right hand hovered at his belt, where his holstered weapon rested silently. "Hey, old man," Kyle said, his voice cold and laced with disdain. "This isn't the place for your fantasies. I'm going to say this once. Leave before I have to remove you by force." Solomon turned to Kyle, unflinching, and in that weathered gaze was something that made Kyle hesitate. Not defiance, but pity. You're going to throw me out of the very house I helped build?" Solomon asked, his voice soft but unwavering. Kyle clenched his jaw. "Look, I don't know what the hell you're talking about, but this isn't a place for old black men going crazy from hunger. Get out." From the back office, Nathaniel Nate Harrington, the branch manager, opened the door and stepped into the room. A white man in his early 40s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal-tailored suit, his golden hair slicked back with precision and ice-blue eyes that carried the chill of authority. "What's going on here?" Nate asked, voice tired but commanding. Kyle turned, visibly irritated. "Vagrant. Claims he owns the bank." Nate looked at Solomon for a long moment, then let out a dry laugh. "Well, in that case, I must be the President of the United States." He strode forward, each step soaked in contempt. "What's your name, old man?" "Solomon Everett Cross," the elderly man replied, calm, composed. Nate let out a dismissive snort. "Great. Well then, Mr. Cross, I suggest you leave before I call police. This bank is not a stage for unfounded dreams." Solomon didn't respond. He simply turned his eyes toward the tall windows, catching his reflection, small, ragged, standing alone amid scorn and doubt. But in his heart was something no one here could take from him, the memory of a truth long buried. The air in the Sterling Trust Bank lobby seemed to hold everyone's pulse in suspension, teetering between mockery and disbelief. Solomon Everett Cross did not retreat. Slowly, he set down the weathered canvas bag onto the polished granite floor. Then he looked up, locking eyes with branch manager Nate Harrington. His voice rang out, deep and steady, like a hymn rising through cathedral walls. "I was one of the co-founders of this bank, Sterling Trust Bank, founded in 1965, alongside a man named Howard L. Gaines. But then I was erased from every record, every memory, because I was black." The words dropped like a stone into a still lake. A flicker of silence swept through the crowd, then shattered into louder laughter than before. "Really?" Ethan burst out, clapping sarcastically. "What is this, a lost episode of Morgan Freeman's biography? Or Samuel L. Jackson with a script malfunction?" Tyler chimed in, but Nate Harrington didn't laugh. He only shook his head, his expression painted with condescension. "Mr. Cross, we live in the 21st century. We have cameras, digitized records, notarized databases. If you were ever a founder of this bank, your name would be in the history books, or at the very least, on Wikipedia." Without a word, Solomon bent down and opened the canvas bag. The crowd buzzed again, murmuring like a pack of high school students at the scent of drama. Some craned their necks. Others held up their phones to record, eyes wide. From inside the bag, Solomon pulled out a worn brown leather ledger, its corners frayed and its pages yellow with age. Carefully, he opened the first page and held it high for everyone to see. "This is the original ledger of Sterling Trust Bank from 1965. It bears my signature, Solomon E. Cross, and that of Howard L. Gaines." Nate stepped closer, reaching out to take the book, though he tried to maintain composure. The creases in his brow deepened as he flipped quickly through the front pages. And then his ice-blue eyes froze on a single, faded line written in old brown ink. Sterling Trust Bank. Founders, Solomon E. Cross and Howard L. Gaines. 14th Wed, 1965, Halcyon Ridge, Georgia. He swallowed hard. Nate glanced at Solomon, then back at the ledger. A part of him wanted to toss it to the ground, to end this performance once and for all. But another part, deeper, more unsettled, whispered something else. Maybe this old man wasn't crazy. Meanwhile, Kyle Brenner clenched his fists. His voice was low and gruff. "Old paper's easy to fake. All you need is some Photoshop skills. You think I've lived this long just to stage a cheap hoax?" Solomon turned to Kyle, his eyes still full of grace. "There's more in my bag. Documents, copies of contracts, photographs. But first, I need you all to understand, I'm not here to ask. I'm here to reclaim." A hush fell over the bank lobby. On the gleaming stone floor, the tattered ledger in Nate's hands seemed to breathe, as if withdrawing the lost warmth of buried history. The air grew heavier by the second, as though every marble tile was holding back time itself. Every eye remained fixed on the ledger Nate Harrington still held. With a slanted brown ink bore the names of the two founders, Solomon E. Cross and Howard L. Gaines. But Solomon wasn't done. He bent down and opened the canvas bag wider. This time, he carefully pulled out a bundle of goat leather-wrapped documents, each edge tied with coarse hemp string. "Unreleased contracts," he said, his voice calm but resonant with conviction. "And here, original banknotes issued by Sterling Trust in 1966, bearing the first logo before it changed." He laid the old bills on a marble counter. $5, $10, $20 notes, all faded, some torn at the corners, but still clearly stamped with an eagle perched on an olive branch. A few people in the lobby stopped laughing. They exchanged glances, no longer amused but unsure. Ethan, the fast-talking young teller who'd had the most to say, now furrowed his brow. "Wait, is this real?" "Hold on," Nate interrupted, placing the ledger down, his hands beginning to tremble. "Old paper and logos don't prove anything." Solomon smiled gently, nodding as if he had anticipated this. He reached into his bag again. This time, he pulled out a folder stamped with the seal of the Georgia State Court. The documents inside were laminated, the edges carefully preserved. "These are notarized copies from 1965, he said, placing them on the table one by one, each document hitting the surface like a gavel. "They show that I never signed over any ownership to the Gaines family. Every signature that followed was a forgery." No one dared to breathe too loudly. And then, something unexpected happened. A softing echoed as the bank's glass doors opened. Stepping inside was a tall, slender white woman in her mid-50s. Her attire was simple yet refined. Ash-brown hair swept into a neat bun. Dark sunglasses, hiding what little they could attention etched across her face. Nearly every bank employee recognized her on sight. Virginia Gaines, granddaughter of Howard L. Gaines, current member of Sterling Trust Bank's board of directors, and the only woman in the family to have ever held an executive position. "Apologies for the delay," Virginia said, her voice calm but hoarse from urgency. "I was notified of this incident by internal security. And yes, I know who he is." The entire bank fell into silence. Nate spun around. "You know him?" Virginia gave a small nod, her eyes never leaving Solomon's aged but resolute face. "Yes. When I was little, I called him Uncle Solomon. He used to visit our home on weekends. He taught me how to play piano, always brought me cinnamon candy. My mother said to treat him like family. Then one day he just vanished. No one ever explained why." She turned back to Solomon, her eyes glistening. "My entire childhood was haunted by one question. Where did Uncle Solomon go? I thought he'd died until college, when I majored in history. While going through archival material for a thesis, I stumbled across a faint name in old ledgers, Solomon Cross. When I asked my grandfather about it, he said only, don't dig up the past. Some things are best left buried." Virginia took a deep breath, her voice softening. "But I couldn't forget. And today I stand here to prove that not everyone in this family has lost their conscience." Solomon stared at her, his eyes filled with disbelief and emotion. He had not expected that the little girl once perched on his knee learning piano would be the first in the Gaines family to break a silence that had lasted over half a century. Virginia stepped forward, standing beside him. She looked down at the weathered documents spread across the marble counter, papers that now seemed to be reclaiming their voice. Then she said, clearly enough for everyone in the room to hear, "I believe it's time this bank stopped hiding its past." The air grew thick, like gravity had doubled. Every gaze in the room shifted toward Nate Harrington, the man once seen as the bedrock of the Halcyon Ridge branch. Now, in the presence of Solomon Cross and the moral weight of Virginia Gaines' words, he looked more like a pillar hollowed from within, quivering under the weight of truth. He sat behind the main teller counter, overhead lights reflecting off the sweat on his brow. The documents lay open in front of him, pressing down on every joint, every wrinkle. His eyes were locked on the fading ink, but the name Solomon E. Cross and the bold signature beneath it were still unmistakably clear. Virginia said nothing more. She let silence do the rest, let it chip away at every layer of resistance in Nate's chest. Every ice block of belief built on lies. 15 minutes later, she walked out like a soft breeze, leaving behind a truth that had grown too large to be buried any longer. "This can't be," Nate muttered, his voice trembling. "How is this not in the archives? I read everything, every single page of this bank's history." Solomon replied gently, "You read the pages you were allowed to read, Nate." The words weren't loud. They weren't angry, but they landed like a punch straight to Nate's chest. He looked up at Solomon, no longer with disdain, but with fear. Not fear of Solomon, but fear of the man he now saw in the mirror of his own conscience. Frantically, he began flipping through the documents, reading line after line like a man starved for truth. Faded seals, notarized signatures from the Delaware state courts, a ledger of the original shareholders, all of it sketching a story entirely different from the one he had been taught to believe. His hands started to tremble. "This can't be. If this is real," he stammered, "then everything, from the plaque on the wall to the medal I got from the Gaines family, it's all built on a lie." Virginia said nothing. She stood silently, letting Nate crawl his own way out of the grave he never knew he'd helped dig. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some customers pulled out their phones, recording what was quickly becoming the unthinkable. A high-ranking bank manager unraveling in the marble halls of luxury. "Nate." Ethan, the young teller, stepped forward cautiously, his voice low and concerned. "You okay? Okay?" Nate let out a dry, fractured laugh that echoed across the grand lobby. "I'm sitting on a tombstone I helped build without knowing it. What do you think?" Silence fell again. Solomon took a slow step forward and placed a gentle hand on Nate's shoulder. "I didn't come here to destroy you," he said calmly. "I came to reclaim my name. Truth doesn't kill, Nate. Only lies burn in the light." Nate said nothing. He sank in the chair behind him, eyes locked on that signature from 1965, as if he were staring into his own soul. The last echoes of Nate Harrington's dry laugh faded, and the atmosphere in Sterling Trust Bank froze in place. No one moved. No one spoke. Every eye, from clients to employees, now settled on the one man who stood steady in the center of it all, Solomon Everett Cross. He stood tall, his hand still resting lightly on Nate's shoulder. Sunlight from the glass doors behind him spilled in, catching the frayed hem of his worn coat and bathing it in the warm glow of memory. Across the room, Kyle Brenner clenched his fists. Sweat beaded across his palm. He stood motionless, surrounded by a world he no longer recognized. The sounds in the bank, the murmurs, the subtle nods of agreement toward an elderly black man in tattered clothes, rang in his ears like hammers pounding the pillars of his belief. This used to be a place he controlled. He was the law here, the one who kept those people in line, who made sure order belonged to the well-dressed and the well-off. But now, that order was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He glanced at Director Nate, the man he'd once believed was just like him. But Nate was wavering now. Worse, he seemed to be siding with the old man. A surge of vertigo struck Kyle like a wave. They betrayed us. All of them. Even Nate. They'll throw everything away to chase some cheap fairy tale from an old nobody. And if I don't act now, there'll be nothing left to hold the line. In Kyle's warped mind, truth didn't matter. Power was what preserved order, and he was the last gatekeeper. He felt cornered not by Solomon, but by a society that had turned its back on the old rules. Like an animal backed into a cage, Kyle saw only one response left: threaten. That's when it happened. Click. A cold, metallic sound sliced through the air like a blade of ice. Every head in the bank snapped around to look. Kyle Brenner stood just steps away, his hand pressed firmly to the grip of his service weapon. The Glock peeked out from beneath his navy blue uniform. "That's enough," Kyle growled, his voice echoing across the marble lobby. "This has gone too far. I don't know who you are, and I don't care. But don't think that some wrinkled papers and a dusty name mean you can come in here and stir up chaos." With a sharp motion, Kyle pushed aside his uniform coat and drew the Glock. The cold, black barrel pointed directly at Solomon's chest. A shrill voice cried out from behind, "Kyle, are you insane?" But Solomon didn't flinch. No fear, no retreat. He simply looked at Kyle like a man watching someone twist his own wrist trying to cling to an illusion of power. "You're breaking the rules," Kyle hissed. "You're dividing people. This bank is the backbone of this community. It's not a stage for delusions or some damn dead past." Solomon tilted his head slightly, his voice calm as ever. "Then what about justice? Who is that for?" Kyle's finger tensed on the trigger. Part rage, part fear, when a voice rang out, urgent and unyielding. "Lower the weapon, Kyle." All eyes turned. It was Nate Harrington, still seated, but his eyes, steely and unblinking, cut through the tension like wire. His hand pressed flat on the desk, poise arise. The panic was gone. "Put the gun down." "Now," Nate repeated. His voice was low, firm, commanding in a way Kyle couldn't ignore. Kyle froze. "What are you doing?" Nate continued, stepping forward. "You're about to pull a gun on an 85-year-old man, in the middle of a bank, in front of customers, in front of staff, in front of security cameras." Kyle's lips were pressed into a tight line. His hand visibly trembled. "This is America, Kyle," Nate said firmly. "Here, we don't threaten the truth at gunpoint." A heavy silence followed. Then Kyle lowered his hand. The gun slid back into its holster. The soft click of the safety snapping into place sounded like the final shackle falling away. Solomon didn't move. "Thank you," he said quietly to Nate. Not everyone born into the system chooses silence. The click of Kyle Brenner holstering his weapon echoed like a period at the end of his authority. No one clapped. No one sighed in relief. The entire bank lobby remained wrapped in a heavy silence, as if everyone knew something much larger was unfolding, something they didn't dare name, but could feel shifting right before their eyes. Nathaniel Nate Harrington remained standing. His posture was upright, his gaze no longer evasive. His suit was still crisp, but his face had changed. Gone was the smug confidence of a high-ranking bank executive. In its place, a man wrestling with himself and slowly forging resolve. He stepped forward, placing himself firmly between Solomon Everett Cross and Kyle Brenner. "No one," Nate declared, his voice low but resonant, "will use violence to silence the truth. Not here, not while I'm in charge of this branch." Solomon looked at Nate, unblinking. There was something in his gaze, understanding, surprise, and a quiet sorrow for how long it had taken someone to finally say those words out loud. Then a phone rang, a sharp chime that sliced through the atmosphere like a pin dropped in a still room. A nearby employee answered quickly, then turned toward Nate, pale-faced. "Mr. Harrington, it's the central office. Mr. Howard L. Gaines III is on the line. He wants to speak with you immediately." The entire room seemed to exhale at once. Gaines. The name needed no explanation. The family that had purchased Sterling Trust Bank back in 1967. Wealthy, influential, powerful enough to end anyone's career with a single nod. Nate picked up the phone. "Yes, sir." No one could hear the voice on the other end, but Nate's expression slowly shifted. Sweat dotted his forehead. His jaw clenched. Then he said something under his breath, soft enough that only Solomon and Kyle heard it. "I understand, but I can't do that." He placed the phone down, took a long, steadying breath, then turned to the crowd. "Mr. Gaines," Nate said, his voice carrying across the lobby, "has instructed me to immediately cease all actions and have Mr. Cross removed from the premises, for the sake of the bank's reputation." A ripple of shock moved through the room. "But I will not do that," Nate declared, his voice no longer trembling. "I've read the documents. I've seen the signatures. And I know what we're denying here is a part of history that's been deliberately erased. Maybe I'll lose my position," he continued. "Maybe my career ends today. But if I keep my eyes shut and stay silent, then I've already lost myself long ago." A heavy pause. Then, unexpectedly, Nate turned towards Solomon and bowed. "Mr. Cross," he said, eyes gleaming with resolve, "if you'll allow me, I want to stand with you. I want to help bring the truth into the light." No one moved. No one spoke. But that single bow, from a white man, The branch manager of Sterling Trust Bank, directed at an old black man in worn clothes, collapsed a wall no one had dared touch until now. At last, the truth had an ally, and he bore the name Gaines. In that moment, as Nathaniel Harrington bowed before Solomon Everett Cross, the atmosphere in the grand lobby of Sterling Trust Bank seemed to hold its breath. No phones rang. No footsteps echoed. Only silence, thick, electric, and waiting. Then came a faint sound, the soft clack of heels striking marble. Heads turned. It was Lena Dawson, the youngest teller at the branch, just 24 years old, her natural curls tied back neatly, a brand-new name tag still clipped to her uniform. From the very start, she had stood quietly behind the teller desk, her early expression mirroring the skepticism of others. But now, her face had changed. Her eyes shimmered with emotion. Her lips were pressed tightly, as if holding back something that had waited too long to be said. She walked straight toward the table where Solomon had laid the old ledger and the yellowed court records. In her hand was a faded $10 bill, one of the vintage notes Solomon had presented earlier, with the original Sterling Trust logo from the 1940s. Lena gently placed the bill on the marble. She didn't say a word until she lifted her eyes to meet Solomon's. "I believe you, Mr. Cross," Lena said, her voice unsteady but unwavering. "Not just because of the documents, but because of your eyes of someone who spent a lifetime protecting the truth." A quiet ripple passed through the room. Behind Lena, Jason Liu, the credit officer who had earlier scoffed when Solomon walked in, slowly stepped forward. He set his briefcase down and bowed his head. "You've endured more than any of us could have imagined," Jason said softly. "I'm sorry. I stayed silent for far too long." A few seconds later, Maria Bennett, the corporate accounts officer with tear-streaked eyes, stepped out from behind her desk. She unclipped her name tag and gently placed it next to the $10 bill Lena had left. "We were trained to protect customer trust," she said quietly. "But today I realize if that trust was built on a lie, it means nothing." One by one, Desmond, Fiona, Mark, Amber, they each stepped away from their posts. Each left behind something symbolic, an employee badge, an internal certificate, or even just a sincere apology. The heavy silence in the room began to shift, not into chaos, but into something more profound, awakening. They did not stand because it was required. They stood because their conscience did. Kyle Brenner remained by the door, lips pressed tight. He watched it all unfold, unable to hide the confusion in his eyes. Nate stood motionless, watching his colleagues, his staff, step forward one after another in an unexpected, yet unmistakably genuine act of solidarity. His throat tightened with emotion. He turned to Solomon and gave a small, solemn nod. Solomon, 85 years old, said nothing, but in his eyes, deep as the decades he'd endured, there flickered something no one could extinguish. Hope had returned, and this time, it had an entire team behind it. Solomon Everett Cross stood silently at the heart of Sterling Trust Bank's grand lobby, taking one final look around. The afternoon light pouring through the tall glass windows cast long shadows across the polished stone floor, illuminating every crease on his face, every worn thread on his coat. But there was one thing time could never weather: his unshakable resilience. The room was still. Bank employees, those who had once scoffed and doubted, now stood in quiet lines, nodding as his gaze passed over them. Lena Dawson bowed once more, her hand placed gently over her chest, as if passing a wordless message of gratitude from one generation to the next. Solomon needed no final words, no verdict, no applause, no trumpets. What had unfolded that afternoon was more powerful than any courtroom ruling. He bent down to pick up his faded canvas bag, the companion of decades, carrying not just legal documents but unshaken faith and dreams that never died. As he rose, he did not tremble. In fact, the curve of his back, once bent with time, now seemed to straighten, held up by nothing more than pride. He turned to Nathaniel Harrington, the bank manager, the man who had chosen to cross the line between power and principle. They exchanged a nod, unembellished, no promises spoken, just two men, finally standing on the side of truth. And then Solomon walked out of that grand lobby, through the doors of Sterling Trust Bank, into the fading light of a Thursday afternoon. A place that once met him with contempt, now silently opened its way with respect. On the sidewalk, a small group of customers remained, lingering as if unwilling to leave. An elderly white woman, her hair silver like morning frost, gave Solomon a trembling nod as he passed. A young child, gripping their mother's hand tightly, looked up at him, not in fear, but in wide-eyed curiosity and quiet admiration. Solomon said nothing, but in his eyes burned a quiet, powerful emotion, as if the world had finally seen the man it once tried to erase from history. A silent lesson spread through the heart of Halcyon Ridge that day. Sometimes justice doesn't need a verdict, only a heart strong enough to keep demanding the truth. And when one person truly stands up, an entire generation can learn how not to bow down again. Solomon kept walking, in his worn shoes, along the familiar path. But this time, every step felt light, as if his soul had finally been given its name back. Less than 48 hours after Solomon Everett Cross walked out of the Sterling Trust Bank branch in Halcyon Ridge, Nathaniel Nate Harrington stepped into a private boardroom at the bank's Midtown Atlanta headquarters. In his hand was an old black leather briefcase. Inside, the very documents that had shaken one of the most powerful financial institutions to its core. The 1965 ledger, the original shareholder receipts, legal records, all bearing one name, Solomon Everett Cross. Across the long mahogany conference table sat the steely-eyed titans of the Gaines family. They didn't need to shout. They didn't need to threaten. Their presence alone, 3 generations of banking, politics, and unspoken power, was enough to silence most rooms before a word was spoken. Their eyes were cold, their voices sharp as razors. Every movement carried the unshakable confidence of a class that had never been questioned. To them, Nate was no longer a Star Branch executive. He was a traitor, someone who had dared to rattle the foundation of their financial empire. But today, Nate hadn't come to take orders. "Do you understand what you're doing, Harrington?" The elder statesman, Howard L. Gaines, now 80, the founding partner who once stood beside Solomon, spoke slowly, his voice heavy with unspoken threat. "One wrong word, one wrong move, and you lose everything. You're really willing to bet your entire career, your family, and your reputation on the worrisome, forgotten old man, Howard L. Gaines III, head of international investments, asked coolly. Nate gripped the handle of his briefcase tighter, then nodded. "I know, and I'm ready." He opened the case, laying out each document on the long glass table. No grand speech, no accusations, just the truth, laid bare, undeniable, and finally seen. A sharp scoff cut through the silence. Evidence could be fabricated. Margaret Gaines, the bank's legal director, said slowly, "And if you walk out of this room, you will never serve on any banking board again." Virginia Gaines, Howard's granddaughter, who had remained quiet until now, suddenly spoke up. Her voice was soft, but unwavering. "I reviewed the documents Mr. Harrington sent me last night. I compared them with the internal archives. Some pages have been intentionally removed from the original records." Every eye in the room turned to her. Howard L. Gaines slowly turned his head, his gaze slicing through his own bloodline. "You're siding with him?" he asked, as if the name Solomon was too bitter to speak. "No," Virginia replied. "I'm siding with the truth. If our family erased a man's contribution simply because of the color of his skin, then no honor this bank claims can hold any worth." No one spoke for a few seconds. Then Howard slammed his palm against the table. "You'd burn down an entire legacy for a nobody?" Nate replied firmly. "Real history doesn't need fire to burn. It only needs light." The tension stretched for over 2 hours. But in the end, under pressure from the media, the irrefutable documentation, and the resistance from within their own ranks, the board was forced to authorize an internal investigation. A week later, on the marble wall of the Halcyon Ridge branch, where once only Howard L. Gaines's portrait had hung, a new bronze plaque was installed. Solomon Everett Cross and Howard L. Gaines, co-founders of Sterling Trust Bank, 1965. From a man erased from history, Solomon had become a national symbol for truth and the courage it takes to face it. Across the country, bank branches began hosting panels titled Distorted Histories and Unrepaid Justice. High school students wrote essays about Solomon's journey. In Georgia, a new bill, the Cross Act, was introduced to investigate racially motivated property theft cases from the 20th century. A week after the board's reluctant acknowledgement of the truth, it wasn't just a plaque that marked the shift. Solomon Everett Cross, once invisible, was invited back into sterling trust, not as a symbol, but as a true leader. Over the next 3 months, he declined every grand honor and public celebration. Instead, he proposed the creation of a historical equity and renewal committee, tasked with reviewing all operations, records, and hiring policies to ensure that no shadow of past injustice would ever be allowed to return. He appointed Virginia Gaines, the woman who dared to stand against her own bloodline, as Senior Director of Human Resources, entrusting her with full authority to reform the personnel system toward greater transparency, diversity, and equity. Nathaniel Nate Harrington remained Executive Director of the Halcyon Ridge Branch, but this time with a new mission: to transform what was once a symbol of exclusion into a beacon for the next generation of progressive banking. Inside the bank, a sweeping reform was set in motion. Hiring efforts expanded into marginalized communities. A new advisory board was formed, featuring voices from various industries, backgrounds, and ethnicities. Solomon also commissioned an independent team of historians to rewrite the official history of Sterling Trust, this time with his name finally restored. And then, once the foundation had been rebuilt, Solomon quietly stepped away. No press conference, no farewell speech, just a handwritten letter left on the desk in the executive boardroom, his writing shaky but resolute. I didn't return to run a bank. I came back to reclaim its soul. Don't let it lose its way again. Now, at 86 years old, he lives quietly in the southern edge of Halcyon Ridge. Each morning, he walks the old street that leads toward the bank, not to reclaim anything anymore, but to reflect on a moment in history, the day an old man, once cast out and forgotten, made an entire system of power stop and face itself. He is not wealthy. There is no bronze statue, no medals, but he has a living legacy, a truth reclaimed, and a generation that now understands. Justice may be delayed, but it never dies. And when even one person dares to stand, light will always find a way through the walls of darkness.